Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lauren Tostenson. I work in the Public Information Office for El Paso County, and I am helping put on today's workshop on our water supply review process, which we've had a lot of interest in. We're really excited for you all to join us. We have a great lineup of presenters today who are going to deep dive into this topic that can be sometimes overwhelming. So we want to make this easier for you guys to navigate the process. I just wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping items before we get started and I hand it over to our subject matter experts. There's a Q&A section in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that's where we're going to submit all of our questions. And we will get to those questions at the end. A big portion of this program is for it to be interactive, for you guys to get access to these experts that you wouldn't normally get. So feel free to type questions into the Q&A section throughout the presentation. We will see them, and then we'll go ahead and get to answering those once the formal presentation is over. So don't forget about that. If something comes up, feel free to type it in. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Craig Dossie, who's our Executive Director of Planning and Community Development, and then we'll launch into the presentation. Craig, go ahead.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you everybody who is listening to this and maybe even currently and in the future. Hopefully you find this subject matter very helpful. It's one of those subjects that a lot of folks know happens, but not really how it's happening. So today we want to provide some of the behind the scenes look at what's happening when the county takes the documentation from you all and sends it through the water supply review process, both with the state of Colorado as well as with our county attorney's office and our public health department. So Lauren, we can go to the next slide. So before we launch in today's events, we wanted to also let you know that we have a couple additional events already scheduled for EPC Engage. The next one will be in July. That one we will be covering some of the activities that happen at our front counter, specifically with regard to residential site plans and some of the other permits that we handle at the front counter, things like temporary use permits. So that one will be a very nuts and bolts approach to some of the kind of real-time permitting that we accomplish in person at our front counter, or some of which is also accomplished online. And then we've already scheduled our event for September. That event will cover the do's and don'ts of concrete work. We anticipate that will include both our engineering staff and our inspection staff, as well as some of the folks from our Department of Public Works. And we're even reaching out to the city of Colorado Springs to hopefully have them as part of that presentation as well. So real excited about that. Those two events that are coming up. Also, if there are other topics that you'd like for us to cover, again, we would be happy to entertain those. If you just reach out to either Lauren or myself, or even Nina Ruiz, who's on this as well, let us know those things that you'd like for us to address. We're more than happy to consider those and schedule them for a future event. So, Lauren, next slide, please. So today we have a whole bunch of presenters, really exciting lineup here. We have 3 county employees. We have Lori Seago with our county attorney's office. She'll be covering some of what she handles in terms of the water review process for the county. We have Nina Ruiz, who's our planning manager. She'll be going over sort of the processing, kind of the document handling, the real procedural type things of getting through the process. And then Kat McGarvey, who's with our El Paso County Public Health Department. We're also really excited to have folks from the state of Colorado join us today. We have Kyson Ingalls, Wenley Dickinson, and Kate Fuller. And hopefully they'll introduce themselves a little bit more in what they do specifically, but really happy to partner with both our public health department and the state, the various state offices, as well as have Lori with our county attorney's office here. So really grateful to have all of them here. Hopefully this is a very valuable learning opportunity for all of you. So with that, the things that we're going to be covering today, we're going to be covering statutory provisions and some of the sufficiency finding process and requirements. We're going to be covering the types of water supply systems. And then we're going to be looking at the actual review process, both going into that finding of sufficiency, as well as what happens post-approval after the project's been approved, and some of the follow-up that sometimes needs to occur with some of those as well. So I'm going to step away, and I'm going to hand it off to Lori Seago to kick us off. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lori Seago. I'm with the County Attorney's Office. For those of you that are used to dealing with Cole Emmons in our office, if you have not heard, I'm sad to report that he has retired. So I am taking over his role when it comes to reviewing water supply information with respect to new subdivisions. Wanted to start with statutory provisions. They're not particularly helpful when it comes to the details of this process, but we did want to provide some basic foundational information and let you know where we start when we develop our processes. So I'm just going to run through a few statutes for you. The water supply requirements start with state law in the subdivision regulations, and it is state statute that requires that evidence of adequate water supply in terms of quantity, quality, and dependability be found before a final plat can be approved. Several years ago in El Paso County, the Board of County Commissioners determined that the quantity that must be available in order to make that finding of sufficiency for water supply is enough to meet the annual demand for 300 years. That is different than state law. State law only requires sufficient quantity for 100 years, and so El Paso County does have that higher standard. Next slide, please. Just to highlight a couple of other important statutes are those that address wells for those subdivisions that are going to rely on wells for their water supply. Some wells, as you've heard, are exempt. Exempt wells do not fall under the Water Rights Administration, and they're not administered under the priority system that is in place in Colorado when it comes to determining priority of water rights. Those exempt wells are typically limited to ordinary household use, and they must produce 15 gallons per minute or less. And they also include wells that are in designated groundwater basins. However, typically new subdivisions will have non-exempt wells, and therefore an approved augmentation plan is typically required to replace the water that is drawn from those wells. Next slide, please. State law also creates designated basins within the state of Colorado, and groundwater that's in a designated basin is managed by the Colorado Groundwater Commission. When you have water in a designated basin, it is the commission that establishes new water rights within its jurisdiction, that approves replacement plans for the use of that water, and that issues well permits. Outside of those designated basins, it is the water courts that decree water rights and approve augmentation plans. Next slide, please. Moving on, I just want to briefly go over the types of water systems. There are two broad categories. The first are individual wells. Individual on-lot wells can only be used in subdivisions that have lot sizes of 2.5 acres or more. And what we look at to make those three different sufficiency findings, when it comes to quantity, the developers can use the presumptive use values in order to determine demand, and those are found in the Land Development Code, or they can provide evidence of what they anticipate the water demand is based on other information that they've developed about water use in the area. In addition, in order to prove sufficient quantity, you need to have either court decrees or a groundwater commission determination that establishes the water rights for that property. When it comes to sufficient quality, the planning department relies on a recommendation from El Paso County Public Health. And then finally, with respect to sufficient dependability, in order to reach that finding, El Paso County does require creation of a homeowners association if your subdivision has more than 4 lots, and also requires covenants that contain a variety of provisions relating to water rights, well permit requirements, and augmentation plan obligations. Next slide. For subdivisions that will rely on central water, those are typically, but not always, used for subdivisions that have lots of sizes less than 2.5 acres. In order to reach that sufficient quantity finding, the water provider may have standard demand calculations on which the developer can rely. If not, you can also, again, fall back on those presumptive demand amounts that are located in the Land Development Code. You also still have to provide proof of ownership of or right to use the water by the central water supplier. For sufficient quality, we do presume that central water providers are operating within allowed parameters when it comes to water quality. However, occasionally additional info may be provided by El Paso County Public Health. And then when it comes to sufficient dependability, we require that you provide information regarding the physical infrastructure of the central water supplier, their financial plan, and the feasibility of providing new service outside of their existing service. Next slide. New central water systems occasionally arise when central waters will be supplied, but there is no existing provider willing or able to provide that water. And so when you are creating a new central water system in connection with your development, just a couple of highlights and tips. Pre-planning is key here. It can take up to a year or more to get the state approvals for a new water system that we require in order to support a finding of sufficient water dependability. We have to determine that the construction and the approval of the system is advanced enough that we can comfortably recommend that the water supply is dependable. It is helpful to have a meeting with the Planning and Community Development Department and the County Attorney's Office early in the process to set expectations and discuss timelines in terms of what will be required and when for this process. It's also important to remember that when you are constructing a new central water system, that location and construction of that infrastructure may require a 1041 permit, which is a separate application and a separate process. I think I'll pass it on now to the state in order to discuss new water systems in more detail.
So Nina, I think this is Tyson's turn. Do we have him on the line?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can. So if you want to go ahead and discuss new water systems.
Great. So you're on slide, what is the public water system, correct?
That is correct. So we are on slide number 13.
Great, thanks. So my name is Tyson Ingold. I work for Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I just work with the State Health Department. And we regulate many different things. The State Health Department, obviously, we've been very busy with the pandemic, but we also regulate public water systems and implement the Safe Drinking Water Act of Colorado. So I'll be discussing what qualifies as a public water system, what our oversight looks like, what types of things you have to do if you're a new development, for a few slides, and then obviously around for questions. So I think first and foremost, let's talk about what is a public water system. And that is a definition that is provided for us by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and an old definition from the 1970s. And I'm not going to read the definition, but the rule of thumb is if it's for a lot of development is if it supplies 15 service connections or 15 homes, it's going to be regulated as a public water system. But there is also a second part to the definition, which sometimes means that systems that don't have 15 homes also are regulated as public water systems, and that's the 25 or more for 60 days a year. And I'll explain that calculation in a sec. There are three types of public water systems. There are community water systems that serve year-round residents, and that's really like a small development of more than 15 homes that would have residents, and that would be a community water system. There are non-transient, non-community water systems. I tell people to think of like a rural school that serves the same students every day, but they do not live there. And so that school is on a private or its own well, but has a source of water So it's different than a school connected to a town, sort of standalone deal. That's called a non-transit non-community system. And there's transit non-community system, and that's like a roadside bar. I think I got Cristola, it's up by Woodland Park there, and they have their own private wells, so they're a regulated public water system as well. Different types of systems have different regulatory oversight. Community has the most oversight because people drink the water every day. They live with it, they shower in it, and they cook with it. And so we regulate not only parameters that will make them sick immediately, but also parameters that will make them sick after consuming the water over long periods of time, like 20 to 30 years. Non-transient, non-community like school is similar. It has a little bit less regulatory oversight than the community, but it's pretty similar to community, honestly, in terms of cost and complexity. And then transient non-community is simple because most of the people drinking the water at like Cristola Bar and Grill would be just the customers. They don't live there, so it's more regulated on just that the water wouldn't make them immediately sick. So bacteria and nitrates, things like that. You go to the next slide, or actually I want to say this before you go to the next slide. We do regulate more than 2,000 public water systems throughout the state. Most are very small. And for the 25 or more people, 60 days a year, the rule of thumb I give folks, if they're curious if a certain group of homes is going to be regulated as a public water system on population like that, is if, say it's a group of a few homes, but then some sort of a community center where people can congregate, is you want to take the population served by that water source, like by a well, for the 60 busiest days. And they don't have to be in a row. It could be weekends, say there's a church connected and it's on Sundays it's busy or whatever. The 60 very busiest days, you want to get the number of people served on those busiest days. You want to take an average of that 60 days. If that average number is 25 or more, it is regulated. And that's how that calculates. That confuses people sometimes because they say, well, it's not over 25 for more than 60 days, and that doesn't really matter. The average is over 25. So if you have a few weddings at a community center or a church, you can jump up over 25 pretty quickly. So group of 4 homes connected to a church is usually a regulated public water system. That's what I'm going to tell people. To go on this slide, this is state regulatory requirements. Anybody building a new water system needs to come into the state for design approval on several levels. And this is really established on a few different scales. It's in state statute. I'm not giving you guys a reference here, but it's also in our drinking water regulations that you must submit for approval before you begin construction of any water treatment or before you turn on a well. So that can be confusing because you sort of do have to drill the well through the Division of Water Resources to get us the data we need for you to move forward with the drinking water design. So it's kind of a two-phase deal. You develop your sources, but then you gather some data and submit to us and get approval before you go on and develop the water treatment and the rest of the system. And that is required in our regulations. You're in violation if you do it without our approval. For brand new developments, in the next slide, there's a second requirement. If you're going to be a community water system, you must establish that you have what we call capacity, technical, managerial, and financial. In other words, you need to establish that the water system will be viable in the long term, both in how it's operated and managed, and also how it's financially set up so that it can pay to replace pipes as they break, or new water treatment, or to develop replacement wells when they reach their working life, those types of things. So you'll be sharing with us the overview of your system, but also how it can be managed and operated, and also how the finances are going to work. And that's called the TMF Capacity Planning Manual, or Policy 11, but you must submit and get approval of that. And that's kind of a standalone document. If it's a brand new, built from scratch development, we need to do that piece in the community. And then also for treatment, sources, and storage tanks, the next slide talks about a basis of design report that must be filled out and submitted to us. And that's the second thing. It's Appendix B of our design criteria, but it goes through your system, and we want to look at how all of your water infrastructure is designed. And really what we're primarily focused on is your storage group, and your water treatment, and then any water storage tanks. The actual pipes in the ground, we have design standards for. We don't typically do too much of a review of those. But we do have standards for them. It's just based on the number of staff we have, we really don't have resource to do all those reviews. If you go to the design review applicability summary, appendix A table, it says on the slide, this is just a reminder of the things we do want to see. So if the public water system is making changes to their surface water sources, or drilling new wells, or planning new wells, changing their treatment plant, we want to see all that. And just on the right side of the slide, if you're doing just distribution piping work, so say you're expanding a water line to a few homes, we don't really review and approve those things. Also, if you had a membrane filtration system broke and you bought the exact same time we're replacing it, we don't have to review that either. Or pumping stations and distribution. But otherwise, you can pretty much consider that we would want to, that the state health department want to see it if it's related to a public water system. And that's kind of the limit of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to hand it off, but I'm obviously here for questions.
Thank you. That was great. So now we're going to get into the actual sufficiency review process, and we'll discuss how our department, so how planning and community development coordinates with the applicant, as well as the state, our county attorney's office, our health department, and the various hearing bodies to ensure that a finding of sufficiency can be made. So first and foremost, let's discuss what documents have to be submitted to the county. So all of our documents are submitted online through our EDARP program. We do all of our applications and all of our reviews online. The absolute minimum documents that are to be submitted would include the water supply information summary sheet, and the state is going to go into more detail about the content and what they're doing in their review of that document. The water resources report, and the water resources report does have to be prepared by a qualified professional, and specifically those qualified professionals would be a hydrologist, a licensed civil engineer, a qualified groundwater geologist, or some other qualified professional that has the appropriate experience. So this is not something that an individual homeowner would be able to prepare on their own. It also needs to include documentation and information to support that all three elements of the finding of sufficiency that Ms. Segal went over, including the quality, quantity, and dependability, that we can make that finding. Next, within the Land Development Code under Section 847 of the code, it outlines those specific requirements and content for the water resources report. Additionally, sometime this summer, we do anticipate that we will have some actual checklists that applicants could use to quality control their water resources reports before submitting to us. And another thing that's of important note that is included within 847 of the code, but every single time that a water resources report is submitted to El Paso County, it does have to be updated. The reason that it has to be updated is each and every time that a provider, a centralized provider, makes a commitment, they are reducing the amount of water that they have available. So we would anticipate that their total amounts of available water would be reduced each and every time. So the applicant needs to coordinate with the district to make sure that that is updated every time. When the county attorney's office, the planning commission, and the board of county commissioners are all making their determinations, we would also need to see that there's a state engineer's office letter indicating that they're making a recommendation of water sufficiency, and they're going to cover how they make that recommendation in just a moment. And then if they're on centralized services, we do need that commitment letter from the central water provider and any associated court decrees, groundwater commission determinations, and so on for any well provisions. And then if you want to go to the next slide. So the applicant would submit all of the documentation that we just discussed to our department through EDARP, and then we as the county would route all of that information to the various review agencies. So first and foremost, we're looking for a recommendation from the state water engineer. After the state water engineer has made a recommendation of sufficiency, then it would be routed to the county attorney's office for them to make a recommendation as well. The El Paso County Health Department, their review consists of the water quality review only, whereas the state and the county are looking at quantity and dependability. And after we have from the county attorney's office and from the health department a recommendation for sufficiency of those three elements, quality, quantity, and dependability, then it will be routed to the Planning Commission through a formalized hearing. So as part of their preliminary plan application, the Planning Commission will make a recommendation for sufficiency then to the Board of County Commissioners, who ultimately makes the decision on if they can make a finding of sufficiency for water quality, quantity, and dependability. So now we're going to pass it along to the state, who is going to give an overview of what they are looking for in making that sufficiency finding.
Tina, Kate, and Wenley, why don't you go ahead and take it from here?
Hi, my name is Kate Fuller. I'm a water resource engineer with the Division of Water Resources in the State Engineer Office. The required information that we receive from the county that we rely on is the water supply information sheet. In particular, we need to know how many lots are being created by the proposed subdivision and any water demands that will be incurred by that subdivision. We want to check to make sure that there is documentation of the physical and legal adequacy of the water supply that's being proposed, whether that's a user supply source such as on-lot wells or a municipality supply source. We rely on that water information summary as well as the report. We also want to check the plat map to find out the scope of the project, what boundaries it might be in, as that could impact what rules we rely on to make sure that that source is indeed adequate and legally available. As Tyson said, their department is concerned with infrastructure and water quality. Our office only reviews water quantity, not quality. Next slide, please. We do our review. We are checking to make sure that the proposed uses are consistent with the allowed uses of the proposed supply of water. And in designated basin, which is a geographic area along the eastern half of the state, there are specific rules about exporting water outside of those basins. Because they rely on that groundwater, it's an area that doesn't have a lot of surface water available. We want to make sure that where they're using that water is appropriate and legal. They also have specific groundwater management district rules that might come into play, so we cross-check those. The Denver Basin is a series of aquifers that are layered along the Front Range. They also have their own set of rules that we need to check. As Lori said, statewide we rely on a 100-year aquifer life for our dissemination, but El Paso County has taken that additional step to make sure that a 300-year aquifer life is available. So we'll offer that review as well. Next slide, please. The supplier via municipality or a quasi-municipality will check the statement of commitment from that supplier. In particular, we really want to see a firm volumetric amount that's been committed to the proposed subdivision. Sometimes we'll receive letters that say things like, yes, this project is within our boundaries, but we really want to make sure that they do have an available amount of water that meets the demand for the subdivision and to make sure they have enough water to supply that water. One way we check that is the report that was mentioned that documents what the legal supply of water is for that municipality, as well as the commitments they've already made to other projects. We want to make sure that they're not overextending themselves and that there's not limitations on their supply of water for where they can offer that water or the uses. Occasionally we will ask for an updated report. We do keep those reports on file in our office. In particular, if the report is more than 3 years, out of date, or if the supplier has committed more than 90% of their available supply, we'll ask for an updated report just to make sure that we're not running into any trouble. Next slide, and Wenley, please.
Hey, my name is Finlay. I also work at the Division of Water Resources as a water resources engineer. And I'm going to talk about different considerations for if the source for the project is a well or multiple wells that are withdrawing from alluvial aquifer or a non-Denver Basin aquifer. So like Kate talked about, the Denver Basin aquifers are a series of layered aquifers, and those have special rules. If you're outside of Denver Basin and you want to use wells for the development or the subdivision, you would typically need a plan for augmentation, which is a plan to replace water that's been pumped to prevent injury to existing water rights, or a substitute water supply plan that also provides replacement water, but it's approved annually. So we wouldn't approve substitute water supply plan as the water supply source for a subdivision with residential uses, since we want to see a long-term water supply. And then if you're inside designated basins, you would need a replacement plan if your wells are withdrawing from a source that's over appropriated. A replacement plan is essentially the same as an augmentation plan. It's just approved by the Groundwater Commission rather than Water Court. We also check to make sure that the proposed uses for the development are consistent with the allowed uses as far as the augmentation plan or substitute water supply plan. Inside designated basins, we also want to make sure that the place of use is consistent with the determination of water right that's been approved by the commission. Since inside designated basins, there's usually a restriction on the place of use. And though we don't usually require proof of physical adequacy, the developer is certainly welcome to do a well pump test or submit a report from a hydrologist or hydrogeologist along with the other information. Next slide, please. So if the source are wells or a well from a Denver Basin aquifer, that can either be from water that's been formally allocated or water that has not been allocated. So water can be allocated inside Denver Basin either through the issuance of a non-exempt well permit or a decree from the water court, or if you're inside designated basins, through a determination of water rights. If you're in a not non-tributary source, so the aquifer has some hydraulic connection to surface water, the applicant would also need a plan for augmentation approved by the water court, or if you're inside designated basins, you would need a replacement plan for sources that are not non-tributary with an actual replacement requirement. Next slide, please. And then for wells that are withdrawing water that has not been allocated, that would be a small capacity well permit if you're inside designated basins, or an exempt well permit if you're outside of designated basins. These well permits aren't typically associated with a water right, so that water that the wells are withdrawing are not allocated. If you're inside Denver Basin, if you are in a non-tributary source and you don't have water that's been allocated, sometimes you can still use those wells, but in this subdivision, the wells would need to be re-permitted according to the new parcel size. So if you're in a non-tributary source, it depends on if you're subdividing or not, whether you need to re-permit the wells. If you are in a subdivision, the amount of water that's allocated for each parcel is calculated by using the land area over the aquifer. So for subdivisions where there are multiple lots of different sizes, we look at the amount of water beneath the smallest lot. So that's the minimum amount of water available, and compare that to the estimated water demand that's been proposed and make sure that those are in agreement with each other. You can't have parcels that quote, borrow land from other parcels to increase the amount of water available. So for example, if you had a 10-acre lot and a 30-acre lot, the 10-acre lot can't borrow land area from the adjacent lot in order to increase the amount of water available when we're reviewing subdivisions. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're creating a subdivision with lots that are different sizes inside of Denver Basin. Next slide, please. As far as existing wells, statute requires us to consider whether wells in a new subdivision will cause injury to existing water rights. In new subdivisions in over-appropriated basins and within El Paso County, the groundwater and surface water is over-appropriated. We would consider those wells to cause injury if they're in a new subdivision, which would mean that they would either need to be covered by a court-approved augmentation plan or replacement plan inside designated basins or plugged and abandoned. The exception is, well, there are two exceptions to that. The first would be if the existing well is in a non-tributary source and that water hasn't been formally allocated yet. You can, in some circumstances, re-permit that well as a non-exempt well inside Denver Basin. Also, Senate Bill 155 was passed last year, which allows existing exempt wells that are issued under that specific statute there, the 602 3B2A, to continue operating, even if the land is subdivided. But there are some restrictions, so the well can be the only well, can only be used on one parcel, and no other additional exempt wells can be issued for the other parcels in the subdivision. And this Senate bill only applies outside of designated basins. So the takeaway there is typically wells would need to be covered, existing wells would need to be covered by an augmentation plan or replacement plan unless they fall into that really specific case where Senate Bill 155 would apply. In other cases, if you're doing a subdivision exemption, the existing well can continue to operate as an exempt well, and you would need to get an augmentation plan or plug and abandon the well, but it would still need to be re-permitted since the amount of land area that's associated with the well permit would have changed. So that's true if you're doing a subdivision exemption or maybe a lot line adjustment that changes the size of the lot that the well is on. Next slide, please. And then we're just going to go over water court a little bit. So water court is Colorado's court system that's just for water. You can apply for water rights or apply to change an existing water right through the water court. The water court handles cases that involve tributary and non-tributary water. So that's if you're outside or inside Denver Basin. The water court sees cases related to surface water and groundwater. And then, as we had touched on before, if you're inside designated basins, then rather than the water court having jurisdiction, the Groundwater Commission has jurisdiction. And then the water court is also where you would apply for a plan for augmentation, and that would be approved through the water court. Next slide, please. And this is just a helpful graphic that goes over kind of what tributary groundwater might look like. On the right, there's a well that's pumping, and the arrows are showing that there's water being withdrawn from the stream to the well. And that's because there's a hydraulic connection between the well and the stream. So in systems like this, this water is considered tributary because the groundwater is connected to that surface water. And this is how a lot of aquifers are outside of Denver Basin. Inside Denver Basin, there would probably be a confining layer that would separate the stream and the groundwater, which is why Denver Basin aquifers are administered differently. And then I'll hand this back off to Kate.
Thank you. So as Finlay said, when you have a tributary water supply that's pulling water from the stream system into a pumping well, one of our concerns is how does that impact senior water rights? With a surface water right such as a ditch, if the water right on a ditch goes out of priority and can't operate for a day, let's say, we can shut off that ditch and prevent injury. With a well, the depletion can continue to be felt by the stream system for days or months or years. So it's not really feasible to have people just turn off their wells during certain times of the year. Instead, we really do rely on those augmentation plans. The augmentation plan is approved by the water court, and it will describe how that replacement water is being sent back to the stream system so that the pumping well is not injuring senior water rights. The replacement water does need to be provided in time, location, and amount to prevent injury, and will be required in areas where there's a shortage of water. In other words, if there's more demands on the stream system, more water rights, and there's physically water available during summer, all times of the year. And in Paso County, outside of Denver Basin, that's always the case. All of El Paso County is considered over-appropriated. Some sources for replacement water include a reservoir right that's been decreed for augmentation plan, a changed senior water right. Typically that would be if an irrigator has decided to no longer irrigate a field, they could take their senior water right to court and apply to have it changed to augmentation and make it available to someone else to purchase and apply for their plans. Trans-mountain diversions coming from the western slope and recharge creation. That's usually when you're directing water from your pumping well back into the aquifer system to recharge it. Next slide, please. So in practice, what this looks like, very simply, is if there's a senior water right downstream with an 1880 water right, and they're legally allowed to divert 50 cubic feet per second for irrigation, but there's a well upstream with a much junior water right of 1950. If they start pumping their 5 cubic feet per second, it does impact the stream system, and that downstream senior water right user won't be able to get their full legal allocation. Instead, the well owner will have a replacement water supply through their augmentation plan that directs water back into the stream system above where the irrigator needs it, and that way the stream system is considered whole, and the water rights priority system continues to operate. That's it for me.
Thank you, ladies. Up next is Kat McGarvey with El Paso County Public Health. Kat.
Thank you, Lauren. I am Kat McGarvey, the Water Quality Program Manager for El Paso County Public Health. And up till this point, most of what you've heard has been based in quantity and infrastructure. Where El Paso County Health comes in is through the quality part. So the process between central and private well water sources doesn't really differ. We have the same process no matter what what type of water you are providing. When we do the reviews that are submitted to us as a part of your submission to the EDARP system, we are reviewing those to meet minimum water quality requirements of the Colorado primary drinking water regulations. So there's a defined number of constituents that we look for. Some of those can vary based on aquifer that you are in as well. Those water quality results are submitted with your subdivision plans. Those constituents are tested and are based on the requirements for each aquifer. As I said previously, representative samples have to be analyzed by a certified laboratory. And those laboratories will produce a report which must include the results of every sample analysis completed. Next slide. Lauren, do you have the next slide up? There we go. No.
Lauren, are you there?
Lauren?
Seems like we've lost Lauren.
That's okay. I can still talk and we can catch the slides later. So when we are making determinations for our sufficiency in terms of the water quality after reviewing the laboratory sample results, we are looking at each of those constituents that was tested in with respect to the maximum permissible contaminant levels, or what you would see on your report labeled as MCL. So each of those constituents are provided or analyzed against that MCL level that's established as a part of the Colorado primary drinking water regulations. When constituents exceed the MCL, we have a couple of different paths we can go. Resampling may be a priority for the subdivision creator. Otherwise, depending on the specific constituent and how far it exceeds that MCL, we may determine that recording a plat note is the most appropriate method forward. In many of those cases, it's used as a disclosure purpose. So when lots are bought or sold, the note is tied to that specific lot for the next owner awareness. Some of those notes can also recommend some under-counter treatment units or some sort of treatment unit for the specific constituent of concern. Are we back?
Yeah, sorry about that, Kat. Are we on the, we just finished finding of sufficiency water quality?
Yes, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you. The final water quality sufficiency determination is made and has to be made before the final plat is submitted. So this is where we would review any additional information from previous comments and/or testing that was submitted. And then we will make a final recommendation of water quality sufficiency at that point. Any lots that are sold that are on individual wells are also subject to total coliform testing. That typically is done at a local laboratory, such as the one at El Paso County Public Health, where we look for just the presence of general bacteria that's found in the ground. Those tests are done on an individual well basis and have to be completed before a certificate of occupancy will be issued. The only other thing that we might note as part of the recorded note to plat is there are some areas, and specifically in reference to the PFAS concerns here in Colorado recently, is there may be a site determination that has an MCL with those as well that may not necessarily be found in the Colorado primary drinking water regulations. And I think that is all that I have, Lauren.
Thank you, Kat. We're going to go back to Lori Seago with our county attorney's office to finish this up for the formal presentation. And then we'll go ahead and start taking questions. And just a reminder for everyone, I've got a few. If you have anything that's come up, nothing's really off limits if we're talking about, well, as long as we're in the subject matter. So go ahead and feel free to submit your questions in that Q&A portion section that you'll see on the top right-hand side of your screen. It looks like 2 message bubbles with a question mark. So with that, I'll hand it back to Lori to finish us up.
Thanks, Lauren. Next slide, please. So the county attorney's office receives a review referral request through the electronic EDARP system. Water reviews by the county attorney's office must be completed and the findings made at the preliminary plan stage if you are looking for administrative review of your plat. Please keep in mind that the county attorney's office will not even begin its water review until we have received all of the required documents. That includes your water supply information summary, your water resources report. If you're on central water, you need that commitment letter from the water provider. We need the state engineer's office letter. If you're on individual wells, we need the court decree or the groundwater commission determination. In addition to any deeds, if the party in whose name the decree was issued is not the current owner of the property. So all of those things need to be in place before my office will even begin to look at the information. Attention to detail is important. Please make sure that all the info matches across all of the documents. If the water demand on your water supply information summary is different than that in the commitment letter, for example, or the state engineer's letter, we're going to kick it back to you. We're not, in my office, we're not going to guess which number is correct. So you need to make sure that all of your info matches, and if the project parameters change along the way, please make sure to update all of those documents with the new information. When we complete our water review in the county attorney's office, we will always have 1 or more conditions of approval that need to be fulfilled. Some of those are prior to plat recording and some of those are after. Some of the typical conditions that you will see when you've got a central water supplier are that the property owners comply with the rules of the Metro District or the other water provider. In addition, as we kind of reviewed previously, new systems are going to be much more complicated. And so new water systems are going to generate conditions that require compliance with all of those CDPHE processes, but that also will try to concurrently allow for a certain number of building permits, understanding that certain CDPHE approvals cannot be obtained until you've got a certain number of hookups in your subdivision. And then always we are going to require you in those conditions to update or correct documents if necessary, if some of the information is incorrect. Next slide. If your subdivision is going to rely on individual wells, then some of the typical conditions you will see include creation of that homeowners association. If you've got more than 4 lots, that will require you to provide us with articles of incorporation and bylaws to demonstrate that that organization has in fact been created. In addition, we will want to review your covenants, and the county attorney's office has created a lot of standard language for inclusion in those covenants, and you will see that in those conditions of approval on our water reviews. In addition, the county attorney's office will want to review a draft or sample deed that the developer will use to convey individual lots to the homeowners. We want to make sure that those homeowners are receiving the water rights that they need in order to be able to operate those wells. And again, as with central water systems, it will be a condition of approval that you update or correct certain documents if there is incorrect information, so that we can make sure that the files always have the correct information that can be referred back to if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. And that sums up our formal presentation. So thanks to all of our presenters. This is great information, I know, for our audience. And we've got some good attendance here. So I have a feeling people are interested in this information. So we also have some follow-up questions. I'm going to go ahead and go through those. Again, if you want to submit a question and haven't done so already, go ahead and do it in the Q&A section of the Teams meeting, which should be on the top right-hand side of your screen. So let's see, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is from, a lot of these people just put anonymous, which is totally fine. So we're going to go ahead, and whoever of our presenters would like to jump in and answer these, feel free, and we can make sure everyone gets a chance to chime in if we have multiple agencies who want to give feedback on these. So first question we're going to go to is whether or not you need to separate out the water supply report from the water quality report, excuse me. And they added that, assuming that this is related to quality of water supply and not the OWTA requirements. Does anyone want to jump in on that one? I'll read it one more time. Okay, Kat.
Sorry, you can read it again, but I can also.
No, go ahead. It was phrased a little differently. So just one question that has come up is whether you need to separate out the water supply report from the water quality report.
And I can answer that. So when we revised the regulations at the end of 2019, we did say that the water quality report is a component of the water resources report. So those no longer need to be separated out.
Awesome. Thank you, Nina. Our next question, can you give an example of types of augmentation plans that have been implemented within the Denver Basin? So Kate and Wenley, I think this might be you.
I guess I would say that there are, it's hard to say like what an example would be, but typically either people are under an umbrella augmentation plan. So there's, you know, an entity that operates a large augmentation plan that covers a lot of wells. And so there's already a decree approving the augmentation plan. And so you can coordinate with whoever runs that, and they can amend the plan to include your well. So sometimes that's a path of least resistance that some people prefer if it's available in your area, just because you have to come up with all the engineering yourself. If that's not an option, then there are a lot of, you would need to come up with your own augmentation plan, obviously hiring an attorney and a consultant, like an engineer, to help you with that. Those are pretty typical for small subdivisions that rely on return flows from like septic systems, sometimes return flows from irrigation. Does that kind of answer the question?
I think so. We'll see if they submit a follow-up, but I think that was a good stab, Wenley. Thank you.
Lauren, this is Lori Seago. If I could just add on to that, I just wanted to contribute that what I typically see in terms of augmentation plan is that during the pumping period, so for the first 300 years, the method that's typically used is return flows from non-evaporative septic systems. So in other words, you pump from the well, you use it for your household use, then it runs through your septic system and is returned back to the ground. That is the method I typically see during the pumping period, meaning when the well is in use. For post-pumping depletions of the groundwater, what is typically required is that a new well be dug in a different aquifer, and then that water be used, be distributed on the ground in order to replace those depletions in the aquifer that was used for the original household wells.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. Does that help, Wenley, add to yours?
Yeah, I think what was just described was definitely how residential augmentation plants typically look. They all look pretty similar, especially because in Denver Basin, you only have to replace actual depletion, so only a fraction of what you pump, whereas outside Denver Basin, you have to replace everything that is pumped. So that makes Denver Basin augmentation plans a little easier, I think.
Than outside. Okay, that's a good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is another one for DNR. So Wenley and Kate, I think this will be for you. How do you reconcile all of the threats to water supplies? For example, contamination, drought, climate change, the 300-year water rule. How do you reconcile all those with Colorado's anti-speculation doctrine?
Oh, that is a big question.
Yeah, see, it felt big when I was reading it.
So we can kind of kick the ball over for contamination. Our office doesn't work with that, as I said. In terms of anti-speculation, there's actually a working group right now that was commissioned, I don't know if that's the right word, was created by legislature last year that are currently investigating how to handle speculation in Colorado and whether our current laws are sufficient. I know they're currently working through that process. I'm sure they'll have recommendations moving forward. Otherwise, how do we reconcile all these things? We have a huge group of people who look at water records, at historic water records, consumptive use, whether or not water has been consumed for certain uses. When you have an irrigation water right that you change for augmentation, for example, or for municipal use, it's not enough to say, well, I pulled X number of acre feet last year, so that's the amount of water that we can now change. There's a full analysis of historic use, how much of that water was returning to the system versus being consumed by plants. I feel like I'm just rambling. There's a lot, you're right, there's a lot to consider, and part of it is, like what El Paso County is doing, being really responsible about making sure that water in the Denver Basin is available for 300 years instead of the minimum of 100.
I think that was a loaded question, so good job trying to tackle that one, Kate. Thank you. That's a lot to talk about for sure. And we'll have, we can publish contact information for folks if you guys want to follow up on that one, because that feels like something that might take some more time. Anybody else want to chime in on that? All right. So this one, I'm not sure who this would go to. Is it redundant to ask the water district for a service commitment during preliminary plan and then again for final plat?
This is Lori Sego again. It is if you're requesting that the water findings be deferred until final plat. If you want the county to make sufficiency findings at the preliminary plan stage because you are seeking administrative approval of your plat, then you need that commitment letter at the preliminary plan stage. You will not need it at the final plat stage if sufficiency is found. If you're deferring the water findings to final plat, then you don't need that at preliminary plan.
Thanks, Lori. Craig, did you have something to add for that or no?
No, I think what Lori was alluding to is a few years ago, we were actually able to change state statute to allow the person in my position to approve final plats administratively, but that is if and only if a water sufficiency finding was made at the preliminary plan stage. So that was sort of what Lori was alluding to there, and that would apply to not just a final plat, but potentially a whole series of final plats within the same preliminary plan. So for the bigger developments, it might make sense to get that water sufficiency finding at the preliminary plan stage so that each individual final plat that follows could be approved administratively. But if that's not possible at the preliminary plan stage, then you would be required to provide that commitment letter and the documentation associated with the water sufficiency findings with each individual final plat.
Thanks, Greg. All right, our next one is from Larry. He asks, if a subdivision was built in the 1970s with individual wells, do they have to be updated with the latest rules and regulations?
If this is Finlay, if the wells are already permitted, and there haven't been any changes to the subdivision, then the well permit should still be valid. I think it would only be if you had a replat of the subdivision or something like that that changed the lot number, then you would need to re-permit the well so that the legal description associated with the well is consistent with what the lot currently is. Kate, can you think of any other scenarios?
No, I think you're right. I would also add to that if there's an existing well permit that was issued under policies or statute that has since been revoked, we don't then revoke that well permit as long as when we said the plat itself hasn't changed, the uses of the well are still within the permitted uses that are listed under those conditions of approval. We're not going to take back people's wells. If they were issued under correct statute at the time, they're still in full effect.
Awesome. Nina, did you have anything to add to that?
Lauren, I can add to that.
Okay.
Only if there was the request to create additional platted lots or buildable lots would we open up the process of reevaluating the water supply. Also, there have been times where people have had requested to change their water supply source. So it could be going from one aquifer to another. That could open up the water supply review process all over again as well. And at that point, they would be subject to the current rules and regulations.
Gotcha. And we have a follow-up from Larry as well. He asks if an individual well for a house in a subdivision can be used for a business, i.e. material testing lab, with some of the water being dumped onto the ground. Anybody want to take that one? Seems kind of specific.
Seems like there's maybe a few different components to that question.
Mm-hmm.
It just disappeared.
I just published it. So if you click
okay.
the publish section, yep.
There we go. So I'll answer part of it, and then I think that probably health and state might want to answer parts of it as well. So first off, if you're wanting to operate a business out of your home, then that would likely require you to go through an additional process through our department. So outside of taking a look at water, we would want to process an application to allow for the actual use. And as part of that review, we would send the application over to the state, similar to what has just been described in the finding of sufficiency, but we wouldn't be dealing with subdivision. So we wouldn't be making a finding of sufficiency, but we would be seeking guidance from the state as to if their existing well might allow for that type of activity. And then, I don't know, Wenley, if you want to talk about the conversion of a well permit.
Yeah, so I would say that it sounds like this well, if it's being used for a house and if the owner doesn't have water rights that are associated with the well, it's probably an exempt domestic well. And exempt permits can only be used for either domestic purposes or commercial purposes. So you wouldn't be able to use that exempt domestic well for a business. If you wanted to do that, you would either need to get an augmentation plan to allow those non-exempt uses, or if you were inside Denver Basin in a non-tributary source, you might be able to get a non-exempt well without going to water court. But we would need to look more at the permit. But that's definitely a question for our office. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, and it sounds like if he has more concerns, he should reach out to you guys directly. And just so you're clear, it was the El Paso County Planning Department speaking first there, and then Department of Natural Resource Water Resources speaking after them. So I would get.
And then this is Kat. I just wanted to jump in on the water being dumped onto the ground component. In El Paso County, all wastewater, whether that's gray water, black water, any type of water system has to be routed into some sort of wastewater treatment system, whether that's a central utility or a on-site wastewater treatment system that's individually per home. So water use for commercial purposes and then dumped onto the ground is not permittable in El Paso County.
And Lauren, I would add on to that you definitely don't want to create a drainage issue with adjoining property owners.
Mm-hmm.
You dump water, water's going to go downhill, and that could create issues for an adjacent property owner. So as Nina identified, it might require a permit with county planning office, but with that, we would also be looking at the drainage impacts from that as well.
And Lauren, this is Lori Seago. I will tack on to what Craig said, and also add that you would need to be aware of the illicit discharge ordinance that's in place in El Paso County in order to protect stormwater discharge. That's a completely separate and complicated topic, but I think the overarching provision there is that it is illegal to allow anything but stormwater to enter into the public stormwater drainage system, which includes things like roadside ditches, curb and gutter, detention ponds, things like that. So if anything other than stormwater is getting into those facilities, that is a completely separate violation.
So a lot to think about there, Larry. So hopefully you'll do a little more research, reach out to our folks at the county and at the state to get a little more information about using that well for your business. But thank you for the question. We've got one last one here, and this one's long, so I'll be happy to repeat it. So just stick with me here. So for new subdivisions that will be supplied by existing wells that were not required to adhere to the EPC 300 rule, will the new subdivision be required to adhere to the 300-year rule? And will there be any impact to the current subdivision that the current well is serving with respect to water sufficiency? So it's kind of a two-parter. I can repeat that once I know who wants to tackle that one.
That seems like a great question for Lori.
Lori, do you want me to repeat
Craig.
that for you?
Yeah, I can read it. Thank you.
Okay.
In general, I think it is accurate to say that sufficiency and existing wells are two separate issues. If you have a new subdivision and some part of that new subdivision has a well on it, that fact alone is going to be irrelevant to whether or not there is sufficient water supply underneath the ground in order to supply that new subdivision for 300 years. Some of that information will be supplemented by what may be in the court decree or the groundwater commission determination. But I think the short answer is, in general, those are two separate issues.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to jump in on that one? All right. Well, that concludes our questions. Thank you, everyone. I think we covered a lot of good stuff in that Q&A, so I appreciate it. Thank you also to our presenters. A lot of good information. And just for everyone who is watching with us, if you have a colleague or a friend who might be interested in this, please remember that this has been recorded and we'll go ahead and publish it on our EPC Engage website. There's kind of a library of all of these workshops that we've done. And you can go back and reference any of these topics and rewatch the presentations. We also have, we'll have an accompanying links and resources sheet that goes with every presentation. So the first one we did was on the engineering criteria manual. Last month we talked about wastewater systems. So we're covering lots of topics that apply to all different industries, and we invite you to go check out our website. That can just be found through the regular planning department website on the county website, which is elpasoco.com. So you can navigate from there. But we will be sending out a link to the recording as well, to the same list that we sent the invitation to. So anyone who missed it can rewatch this. And if you would like to join us for the upcoming EPC Engage events that we have in July, as Craig mentioned, we're going to be going over residential site plans and other over-the-counter permits. which will cover a lot of different topics and just kind of good administrative information for any sort of permit or site plan that you might be interested in submitting. And then in September, we're going to look over the do's and don'ts of concrete work. So again, we're open to topics. If you have a suggestion, my email is in all of the invitations. Feel free to reach out. And I do want to say thank you again to all of our presenters. I think this was another great workshop, and I know everyone is very busy, so I appreciate everyone taking time to join us today. Craig, anything else you want to add?
No, I really don't. I just want to thank everybody who was able to join us today. Hopefully this was very helpful. It's amazing to me. I've been doing this for the better part of 2 decades now, and I still learn stuff. So hopefully this is very informative for all of you. I do really want to thank the folks from the state that joined us today. You know, they're covering the entire state, so we're very grateful that they were able to help us out, and we look forward to our next event in July. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.